We're live.
Welcome, everybody. This is the final lecture in our inaugural Rhododendron Week at the National Botanic Gardens in Kilmacurragh. And who better to finish off the week for us than Seamus O'Brien, our head gardener down in Kilmacurragh, and very well known, obviously, among lots of these fans who have signed in this evening to hear him speak. Seamus is very well known right across the world, really, as a very, very distinguished plant stam and plant collector. He's the Irish branch chair of the Royal Horticultural Society Rhododendron Camellia Magnolia Group. And he, as we know, has been head gardener for quite a number of years in Kilmacurragh. Is it 15 years now, maybe, Seamus, 16?
15 years next month, Felicity.
15, and I've worked with Seamus for a long, long time, both in Glasnevin and in Kilmacurragh, and it's always a pleasure to work with him. I was just saying I haven't been on any of his trips yet, but anyway, maybe the next one. So he's going to tell us all about a spring visit to the Sikkim Himalaya, which actually was 6 years ago, believe it or not. But anyway, I'll hand over to you, Seamus. Anybody got any questions? Don't forget to put them into the ask a question box at the bottom, and we'll deal with them later. Thanks a lot.
That's great. Felicity, thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. We have, I see, a staggering number of people viewing this evening from Nova Scotia, from Chile, and from West Wicklow. So it's good to have you here today. And Rhododendron Week is our way of celebrating 25 years of the ownership and management of the Kilmacurragh estate by the National Botanic Gardens Glasnevin, National Botanic Gardens of Ireland, because of course the estate was bought and placed under the care of Glasnevin in 1996. So Kilmacurragh, as you know, had a very tragic history from the early 20th century, and particularly after the Great War, when the two consecutive owners were killed during the Great War, and it caused the estate to go into sharp decline. And it meant that by the 1950s, the gardens had completely gone over. So in 1996, it's changed for the better. The estate was purchased by the Irish government. Kilmacurragh was placed underneath the care of Glasnevin. My predecessor, Paul Norton, moved in 1996 and did heroic work in beginning to sort of reopen the garden and discover plants. So myself and the current garden team continued that to the present, 15 years on from when Paul moved to Glasnevin. And it is an incredibly important garden with a very tragic history, but undergoing what I'd like to think is its second golden era. Now that it is under state care and underneath the direction of Glasnevin. As Robin Lane Fox wrote a couple of years ago in the Financial Times, that the best place to hunt the plant hunters is in the long grass at Kilmacurragh. So some of the most incredibly important plant introductions from right across the world of the 19th and early 20th century grow in the long grass at Kilmacurragh. And the most important of all of those plant collectors or plant hunters is Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker. So Joseph Dalton Hooker, as many of you are aware, was later to become the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, which to this day is the most important botanic gardens on the globe. In the 1830s, he had travelled with Sir James Clark Ross to the Antarctic on the bomb ships and former bomb ships Erebus and Terror. He returned back to England. He was looking for a second expedition where he could study, having studied a polar flora, he was looking to study a tropical flora. He had two choices. He could have went to the Andes, but he chose the Himalaya. He carried out a huge amount of plant collecting, including seed collecting, in 1849. And as you'll have seen from the videos that we posted on our website during the week, on the 22nd of April, 1850, a large consignment of seed arrived at Glasnevin. And those seedlings were rhododendrons. The seedlings raised were rhododendrons. They were sent here in 1862, and they still survive here today, the bulk of them. So when I look out from my upstairs windows, I'm really fortunate that I live here on the estate in the centre of the gardens, in a house next door to the ruins of Kilmacurragh House. And when I look out my upstairs windows, what I see are towering tree-like rhododendrons. And surrounded by these and knowing the history of them, I was inspired to travel out to the Himalaya on several occasions and write a book about Joseph Dalton Hooker, which was published by Q Publishing in 2018. So that's the subject partly of my talk tonight. I travelled 4 times to Sikkim. And what I'm talking about tonight really is a sort of a gentle ramble in the Himalaya in April, May 2015, the results of that trip. So the opening slide is of our group. So we're on the India-Nepal frontier. We've just crossed the border from India into Nepal. We're on a place called Mount Tongloo, a mountain that was explored by Joseph Hooker in 1848. And we're caught in the pre-monsoon mist. So Glenn, we'll move on to the next slide, please. So this is Joseph Hooker's original map taken from, he published a report on his travels in 2 volumes, Himalayan Journals. It became a classic in its day. Hooker, as I mentioned, had previously travelled on the Ross expedition to Antarctica, and he was a trained cartographer, so mapping was one of his fortes. And what you've got to remember about this trip to India was that it was financed by the Navy. And they weren't particularly interested in natural history specimens. They were really interested in the strategics of mountain passes, especially considering this was the era of the great game, and Britain had always worried that its prized possession, India, was going to be annexed from the north, from Tibet and Afghanistan, by Russia. So Joseph Hooker mapped Sikkim. And what is amazing about that map is that it's absolutely accurate. You can still use it today. And it was used 50 years later by Captain Sir Francis Younghusband during his Tibet expedition when he crossed the borders to North Tibet and made his way up into Tibet from there. So our route took us, if you look at Hooker's, the main map on the left, from Bagdogra. So we flew in to Bagdogra from Calcutta, made our way up to the hill station at Darjeeling, and climbed Senchal, a mountain ridge that it sits on. And from there, we travelled down just slightly southwest to Mount Tongloo, which you can see there, just southwest. Mount Tongloo is a large mountain that sits on what's called the Sinjalila range. And you can see that that travels right up north above Mount Tongloo. And in the sort of upper part of the map, you see that V and that dark dot. So that is Mount Kanchenjunga, which is the 3rd tallest mountain on the planet, the tallest mountain in India. It's a staggering 28,200 feet high. So to get back to Darjeeling, the hill station, we travelled from there north to the present capital of Sikkim, Gangtok. And above there, we travelled up the Tista River into North Sikkim to a place called Chungthang. And Chungthang is where the 2 feeders of the Tista meet. And you've got 2 major valleys. You've got to the east, you've got the Lachen Valley, and to the west, you've got the Lachung Valley. La means pass, so one means small pass, what the other one means large pass. And above there, up to Yumthang and Thangu. So at that point, we're right up on the Tibetan border. And if you look at the map over to your right, you can see the position of Sikkim. I should say that Sikkim, present-day Sikkim, is less than the size of County Cork in southwest Ireland. It's pretty small, but given its surface area, you get tremendous valleys and you get staggering high peaks. The surface area is massively exaggerated. So it sits wedged in the Himalaya. At the time of Hooker's visit, it was an independent kingdom. Nowadays, it's a state of India. To its west is Nepal. To its east is Bhutan, and to the north is the Tibetan plateau. And then, of course, to its south are the plains of India. So moving on to the next slide, we take you to the hill station. So the hill station was so-called discovered by two soldiers, one from Britain and one from Ireland, in 1835. And it, of course, served as the escape by sort of the colonial administration and soldiers from Calcutta. Calcutta had been founded as a colonial city. It had a pretty awful climate, enormous heat, humidity, awful problems with typhoid and diphtheria. So this is a place where British and Irish soldiers and colonial administrators could escape to. It sits at an altitude of about 7,000 feet. And in the upper slide, you can see Eton in India. So this is St. Paul's School. It's the most exclusive boys' school in India. It was set up in the colonial era. And if you look directly beneath the tallest peak, which is Kanchenjunga, you can see a small building underneath. And that is where Joseph Hooker lived for the earlier part of his travels in Sikkim. And that was a house that belonged to an English naturalist and zoologist called Brian Hodgins. So any of you who are familiar with rhododendrons, you'll know that Hooker named Rhododendron Hodgsonii after him. Robert Fortune, the famous Scottish plant hunter who introduced tea for the British East India Company from China to India, he stayed there. And the very tall conifer to the left is a cryptomeria, a Japanese cedar that Robert Fortune brought from China to India. Spectacular location, absolutely beautiful hill station, and a real melting pot of different cultures. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. Sikkim sits just off the Senchal range. It's one of the most heavily explored areas botanically anywhere in the world. Lots and lots of different type specimens were gathered here. Beautiful views of the Himalayan range, and that's what makes the hill station at Darjeeling so spectacular. There is nowhere along the length of the Himalayan range where you get better views of the mountain peaks. So we move on to the next slide. We'll just give you a little bit of history and the Irish connections with Darjeeling and Senchal. In the 19th century, at one time, a staggering 47% of the army in India came from Ireland, from all different backgrounds. And not just that, something like 30% of engineering graduates from places like Trinity College in Dublin and from Queen's University in Belfast, they travelled out to British India to work on enormous infrastructural projects, railways and so on, and take part in the colonial administration. So one of those people was a guy called Harry Corbin Leving. He came from an old Westmeath family, and this is his home. It's Knockflynn Castle in County Westmeath. And if you look just beneath there on the left, you can see it's the isotype specimen in the National Herbarium at Glasnevin of a fern he discovered in 1875, Pseudophygopterus levingii. And then across the way, just on the top right, is Daphne Leving Shackleton. She's an Irish botanist. She's an ancestor, and she travelled with me. So it was very exciting for Daphne to travel with me and see his fern collections in the wild. Because just beneath Daphne again, you can see a fern, Polypodoides amina, which is in our collection. So we've got this staggering collection of ferns at Glasnevin, collected in the 19th century by people like William Griffith and by Leving. And that same fern, you can see it up in the bough of a huge cashmere cypress just to the right there. So we'll move on again to the next slide. And this is Senchal, and these are some of the plants that we saw there. It was post-monsoon, so it's very misty at the time of our visit. Some very exciting plants growing there, including on the bottom left and right, two species of Areobotria, so Areobotria hookeriana, but even more exciting, Areobotria petiolata. So these are loquats and far better species than Areobotria japonica, I think, if they're ever introduced to British and Irish gardens, because they don't need the sort of heat that Areobotria japonica, common loquat, needs. So next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk about every plant on every slide, but I do want to talk about Helwingia himalaika on the right. So this is a curious plant. It's in its own family, Helwingiaceae. And by a curious sort of process of evolution, the pedicel or flower stem it's evolved that the pedicel is fused to the midrib of the leaf, and it flowers off the leaves and fruits off the leaves. So it's one of these very curious plants. Helwingia, the genus extends down into China. We grow Helwingia Himalaya, Chinensis, here in gardens at Kilmacurragh. So moving on to the next slide. These are some of the other plants, and I had done a fair bit of research before all of the trips, and it was exciting to get out at the flowering stage of year, because having read Joseph Hooker's Himalayan journals, he talks about the floras that he used in Himalayan journals, and he talks about seeing some of the cobra lilies, Aracema, and the flora that he used was a flora that had just been published by Nathaniel Wallach on the flora of Nepal. And it was amazing to revisit there 160 years later and see the very same plants that Hooker had seen there himself. So we'll move on again to the next slide. So now I see a comment has just come through that the slides are not progressing. So I'm hoping that's not happening, that you all can see these slides. I know we did have trouble setting up with Richard last night, so just let me know if you're having problems. So we've moved at this stage from the Senchal range by Darjeeling. We've traveled across the valleys to the southwest. That's great. Okay, we can see. That's good. Thank you. And we're just about to climb Mount Tongloo. So looking at this slide, this town straddles the international border. So when you're on one side of the street, you're in Nepal. When you're on the other side of the street, you're in India. So we actually had to bring our passports with us for climbing this mountain. So moving on to the next slide then, really glad the slides are moving on here. So this is Tongloo. Take a moment to focus. So Joseph Hooker, of course, he had amazing experience of travel, particularly in the southern hemisphere when he traveled on his Antarctic trip, and he compared the sort of forested ridges of Tongloo to places like Tierra del Fuego in South America and to the South Island of New Zealand. I've been to both places, and I have to say it's very apt, look very, very similar. Extremely richly forested in parts even today, and just a mega flora, an incredibly rich flora, varying from the base of the mountain to subtropical, and then once you get to the top, you're into a sort of a cold temperate flora. Okay, so we'll move on again. So I just want to talk about some of the other explorers on Tongloo. So Joseph Hooker was the first person to to travel there and to climb its slopes. It's even in the 19th century, it was in relatively easy reach from Darjeeling. It just meant dipping down into these very deep valleys. Tongloo has really spectacular views of the hill station and Kanchenjunga. So he was followed 20 years later by Sir Henry Elwes. Now, Sir Henry Elwes came from Pulsburn Estate in England. He was a big game hunter. He was an avid plantsman. He sent his collections to places like the Royal Horticultural Society's garden den in Chiswick, but he also sent to Glasnevin, to David Moore, and to his successor, his son, Sir Frederick Moore. And about a year later, the mountain was climbed by Marianne North, and she is a great hero. Came from a very wealthy background. She never married, so she was very independent in her lifetime, and she travelled the world painting these scenes and plants. And if you visit Kew, one of the sort of the highlights of that visit will be the Marianne North Gallery, where all of her paintings are on display. And of course, the mountain was botanized by Harry Corbin Leving. So that view you can see of Marianne North's. We matched it, and you can see from my upper photograph on the left, it matches it perfectly. In her biography, Memories of a Happy Life, she writes about painting out the middle ground, and that makes Kanchenjunga look as though it's almost falling in on of the scene, the dak bungalow. So what you're seeing in her painting is a dak bungalow, and it's still there, believe it or not. It's been modernized, but that bungalow is still there to this day. She slept in it when she painted there. In the absolute foreground, it may not be very clear, are blue poppies, Meconopsis wallichii. The trees in the foreground are Quercus lamellosa, and then those sort of bushes that you see in the middle ground are Rhododendron grande, which we grow here, and I think which you've seen on several of our videos at this time. So we'll move on to the next slide. So Joseph Hooker, if you helped him, if you travelled with him, and if you had given him sort of any help at all during his travels, he named the most wonderful plants after you. So when he sailed out from England in November 1847, he travelled in the suite and convoy of the new Governor General of India, the Marquis of Dalhousie, and his wife Sarah, Lady Dalhousie. And when he was plant hunting around Darjeeling and on Tongloo, he came across this epiphytic rhododendron. So the image on the left is from the frontispiece of rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya. On the bottom, you can see the actual type specimen, the very specimen that he collected in Sikkim. And that, of course, is in one of the old herbarium wings at Kew, which you see on the bottom right. So he named this rhododendron Dalhousie. And if we flick on to the next slide, this is the plant in the flesh. And even those photographs don't do it justice. The blossoms, the individual blossoms are absolutely huge. They're incredibly scented. It grows to about 5-6 feet tall. And we saw it not as an epiphyte, but as an epilite. It grows on rocks also. An epilite or an epilite is a plant that grows on rocks. It was growing just off of cliffs. And we know that it grew at Kilmacurragh historically, but Thomas Acton actually did leave a note to say that he tried it several times, that it didn't always succeed, that you would get every couple of decades, you would get an awful winter that would kill it. But Thomas and Janet Acton, they gardened here at Kilmacurragh at the end of the Little Ice Age. And of course, since their time, the climate here has warmed up with global warming. So it's certainly something that we would really like to trial here again. So next slide, please. Okay. And William Griffith. So William Griffith, you can see by the dates beneath his photograph, he was an English botanist. He died when he was 35. He's one of these absolutely brilliant Victorian botanists that died far too young. William Griffith, when he died, his herbarium, it comprised 8,000 species that had been gathered from as far apart as the Caucasus down to Malaysia. In the 1830s, he collected in Bhutan, and including lots and lots of rhododendrons. So Joseph Hooker did collect the same species 10 years later in Sikkim. But Hooker was absolutely fair. When he returned back to England, he knew that Griffith's herbarium was buried in the vaults of the East India House in London. And he took them out, he brought them to Kew, and he gave full credit to William Griffith for what he had discovered. Had Hooker chosen, he could have chosen to ignore them, but he gave Griffith due recognition for that work. So there's lots of plants in the Himalaya named for Griffith and named by Joseph Hooker, and mostly named in the Flora of British India, one of Hooker's greatest publications. And this is Rhododendron griffithianum. It's one of the parents of Rhododendron loderi. And going back to Glasnevin and going back to Sir Frederick Moore, there's a letter in our archives where he's writing to Isabel Paul Acton in the 1920s. They're discussing Rhododendron loderi, and he states, "I told a few people to name it that." So some of the other plants we saw there are Aracema griffithii, and this is major copper lily country. So Rhododendron griffithianum, its bark it's a very variable plant in the wild. You can see that its bark color there is grey. The form that we grow here is a sort of a very rich mahogany cherry brown. And even in terms of the blossom, you can see that particular form had a really enlarged red calyx behind the corolla. So Glenn, we'll move on again. So Rhododendron arboreum var cinnamomum Campbelliae group. It's a bit of a mouthful, And it's something that, if you remember Matthew's talk earlier this week, he showed a slide of this from the rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya at Glasnevin, with a spray of blossom that we had both picked earlier that day. And there it is in the wild. So Joseph Hooker, he named Magnolia Campbelli for Archibald Campbell, who was the superintendent of the hill station at Darjeeling. He was a Scot. He came from the west coast of Scotland. His wife gave birth to a little girl while Hooker was out there. And she named the child Josephine after Joseph Hooker. So as a compliment, he had his father pick one of his Sikkim rhododendrons, and it was named Rhododendron Campbellier for Mrs. Campbell as a thank you. So Glenn, we'll just move on again. So Tongloo, it is a staggering flora, and these are all horticulturally worthy plants. So you see plants, familiar plants like Purus formosa, and another one of my favourites, Viburnum erubescens. It grows in one of the old shrubberies at Glasnevin, but you can see how variable it is in the wild. Pure white forms, and in these lovely forms with pink tinges. And Berber's insignis meaning remarkable. So this was one of Hooker's discoveries, and it really is a remarkable species, these huge leaves. And I've seen that in several places, both in Sikkim and in Arunachal Pradesh. So we'll move on again. Holboelia latifolia. There are so many good climbers on this mountain, including, by the way, Clematis tongluensis, which is named for the mountain itself. But Holboelia, I'm sure you've seen it in cultivation. It's not uncommon, but it was just a thrill to see this plant in the wild and see it absolutely in abundance, running right through trees and smothered in these lovely violet blossoms. So we'll move on again. So Richard Baines, in his great lecture yesterday, he showed a great slide of Rhododendron falconeri, a lovely white flowered form that grows in the garden at Logan, which of course is a satellite garden of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. And if you look on the bottom right, so this is a plant that grew until recently at Kilmacurragh. Sadly, through old age, we've lost all of our old Rhododendron falconeri. And that, for me, is typical cultivated Rhododendron falconeri, primrose yellow blossoms. I remember when I first looked at the plate in Rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya, saw a white blossom. I thought, that can't be right. You know, it was unlike Hooker to make a mistake. But lo and behold, we climbed Mount Tongloo at flowering season, and all the plants we saw were white flowered. So it is variable, and that's one of the great things about traveling out to the wild. You're not seeing one plant, you're seeing them in thousands, and you're seeing that all of that sort of morphological variation in the wild. Again, if you befriended Hooker and you helped him in his travels, he named these great plants for you. So Hugh Faulkner was a Scot, and he was the superintendent of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Calcutta, now the Indian Botanic Gardens in Kolkata. And he was one of a number of people that smoothed the way for Hooker's travels. And when Hooker was trying to decide, would he go plant hunting in the Andes in South America, or would he go to the Himalaya, it was Hugh Faulkner who persuaded him. He said, come over, I'll look after you, I'll set it up for you. Okay, Glenn, we'll move on again. Lots of trees, and it was such a great time to trek up those mountains. And you can see some of what we saw there. Enkianthus deflexus, this amazing form with almost black flowers. I've never seen it as good as that in cultivation. Acer Campbellii, which Hooker named for Archibald Campbell. And then up on the top, Sorbus hedlundii. I was really pleased to see this tree coming into leaf. Fantastic coming into leaf, these beautiful new growths. Sorbus hedlundii is a Kilmacurragh plant. The very first place that it grew in cultivation outside the Himalayan range was here in gardens at Kilmacurragh. Seeds had been raised from Thomas Thompson's consignment of seeds that arrived into Glasnevin in the 1850s. And for a long time, about 70 years, the only representation of it in cultivation was a single tree here in gardens at Kilmacurragh. It forms staggeringly large trees, enormous trees in places like Mount Mainam in central Sikkim, but fantastic to see it beginning to unfold its foliage early in the spring. Acer Sikkimense, so lots of plants named after Sikkim. And it is staggering that in an area with a political border smaller than County Cork, that it has this enormous flora. I mean, if you look at Orchidaceae alone, there's over 800 species of orchids native to Sikkim. So we'll move on again. Okay, this reminds me slightly of when the mist system comes on in the Great Palm House at Glasnevin, and you just get the silhouette of palms. So this is what it's like in the pre-monsoon. And the Indian monsoon, of course, plays an enormous role in the evolution of the Indian flora, and of course the uplift of the Himalayan range. And it's this sort of absolute 100% humidity that has allowed on one side of Tongloo, one flank of the mountain, to build up of cloud flora. And if you look into those trees, you can see all sorts of sort of epiphytes, these sort of big bulges on the trunks of the trees itself. So there are dozens and dozens and dozens of plants up in those trees. So you've got vaccinium species, you've got rhododendrons, agapetes, orchids, and dozens and dozens and dozens of species of orchids, ferns, mosses, algae. It's an extremely rich flora. So it's great when you get a storm and it takes a tree down, because it allows you to see this hidden aerial garden that's above you. So we'll move on again. So these are some of the plants we saw. We weren't there just to see rhododendrons. Orchids are, I have to say, I've got a sort of a wide range of interest in plants, everything from annuals to trees, shrubs, subtropical plants to hardy plants. Collagenae nitida is one of the orchids that was in bloom absolutely everywhere. And for Daphne Leving Shackleton, really exciting for her to see this lovely little Philippi fern. So this is Hymenophyllum levingii. We do have Hymenophyllum species here in Ireland. It's tiny, and you can see from the type specimen in Paris, it is absolutely tiny as well. And for Daphne, who was retracing the route of her forebear, who climbed this mountain in 1888, it was really exciting for her to see the plants and places that he had done. One of her other ancestors was based in the south of India, and played a major role in the development of that region in the 1880s also. Okay, we'll move on again. One of the other plants that we saw near the base of Tongloo was Begonia cathcartii. So John Ferguson Cathcart was a retired Bengal judge. He loved India so much that he didn't want to go back home to England, so he stayed living in retirement in Darjeeling. And when he was based there, he trained Indian artists in the European technique of botanical illustration. And when he was returning home to Europe with all of his goods and all of his possessions, and these about 1,000, almost 1,000 folio drawings of plants, he died very suddenly in Switzerland. So his family gifted all of these paintings to Kew. Hooker had them reworked by Kew's botanical artist Walter Hood Fitch, and this is the result. So this is the frontispiece of illustrations of Himalayan plants. It's probably the most lavish Florilegia ever published on the Himalayan flora. And what is amazing to think is that when you look at that frontispiece, most of those plants, when it was first published in 1855, hadn't reached cultivation. So Magnolia campbellii in the bottom centre, it still had yet to flower. First place it blossomed, by the way, was in County Cork, just in Cove, outside of Cork City. Some of the other plants you can see on that frontispiece are blue poppies. You can see Rhododendron barbatum, Rhododendron arboreum. You can see agapetes. You can see Pleione praecox, all sorts of wonderful plants. And of course, the palm running up the right is Wallachia, one of the rattan palms named for Nathaniel Wallach. So great to see Begonia cathcartii. That particular work, by the way, it sells for staggering sums when it does become available. It's for sale in the Netherlands at the moment for €25,000, so far beyond my reach, I'm afraid. Okay, we'll move on again. So we've returned from Tongloo. So again, just remember, I'm taking you on a sort of our route through Sikkim in 2015. And we're back at Darjeeling. So, and you can see the tea plantations. So sadly, actually, Robert Fortune just about the time that Hooker visited, just before, in fact, he brought tea from India, and that meant the mass felling of forests. And Hooker tells the tale of when he stood in his time in 1848-49 at a hill station looking out over the mountains, and he said that all of the mountains approaching Kachinjunga in March were painted pink with blossoms of Magnolia campbelli. So when we trekked Tongloo, we saw entire forests, but you've got to travel a long way to see forests of Magnolia campbelli today. The image in the top left, I hope you can see it because it doesn't look terribly clear to me, is Brian Hodgson's house. And what is amazing to relate is that you can see the veranda on the front, and Hooker actually discovered 3 species of new fungi on that veranda. So that's what it was like for these early plant hunters. You could literally step outside the front door of your house and everything in front of you was absolutely new to science. So when we say he discovered, really, I should actually clarify that the Lepcha people and who are the native people of Sikkim, they of course had their own colloquial names for these plants. They knew all about them. But what the European and North American and Western plant collectors did, they brought them back and they brought them to the notice of Western science. Okay, we'll move on again. So traveling north from Darjeeling, you travel up to the tropical Tista Valley, and it is one of the feeders of the Ganges. And the view that you're looking at are the turquoise waters of the Tista River. It's a huge river coming down from the glaciers of Tibet, so full of turquoise glacial silt. And you can see joining it just to the left is the Great Ranji River, and this is what separates North Sikkim from Darjeeling district. And these are what you see south of that river is what was annexed by the British East India Company after the famous hostage crisis that occurred when Joseph Hooker and Archibald Campbell were kidnapped and placed under arrest by the Prime Minister of Sikkim at the time. It's a tropical valley full of really good plants. And if we move on to the next slide, I want to introduce the national flower of Sikkim. I'm going to talk tonight about, and watch this for the poll, by the way, because we do have a poll. You can see there are 2 questions coming up and a trick question beneath. So this is the national flower of Sikkim. It's Dendrobium nobile. And you can see just how steamy that valley is in the background. In the 19th century, dreadful climate, full of malaria, and a dangerous place for anybody to live and travel in. So this is Dendrobium nobile. You can buy it in Tesco's, that's how common it is, but just great to see it in its wild state in Sikkim. Okay, Glenn, we'll move on again. So this is a tropical species of magnolia. So this is Magnolia hodgsoni, named after Brian Hodgins. And as I mentioned, Hooker stayed in his house in Sikkim. Brian Hodgins had been the ambassador, the British ambassador at the Royal Court in Kathmandu in Nepal. And when he retired, he also didn't want to go back to Britain. So he bought a house above the hill station. And of course, Hooker named lots and lots of good plants for him. So this is Magnolia hodgsoni. It grows in tropical regions of northeast India. Okay, Glenn. So traveling up to the head of the Tista River, you meet its 2 feeders, the Lachen River and the Lachung River. And at that junction, you meet a little village called Chungthang. And as you can see from the text, it is the gateway to those major valleys, and they are the 2 unmissable valleys in Sikkim. I know there's so a lot of plants people sitting in tonight that have been there and will recognise this place. It's also the type locality for Rhododendron madeni. So Rhododendron madeni was one of 2 rhododendrons named by Joseph Hooker for 2 amateur Irish botanists. I'll come to another one in a moment. So Edward Madden, he was a soldier in the Royal Bengal Artillery. He travelled 4 times in India. He had 4 tours of duty. He was one of many Irish soldiers based in India. And Hooker named this rhododendron for him. Madden sent his collections to Glasnevin, by the way. And this is one of the rarest rhododendrons in the Sikkim flora. And what is slightly frightening is that within view of the population is this enormous dam. And you can see the sort of the ecological damage that that has done in this area. It's absolutely vast, absolutely huge. Sikkim makes loads of money from hydroelectricity. So this is one of the things that we want to point out this evening is that rhododendrons, there's 1,200 species, and a huge number of those species are threatened in the wild. Richard Baines showed a species last night from Taiwan that's already become extinct. And one of the things that we're very keen to sort of get across is that it is one hybrid, a rhododendron ponticum hybrid that has given the genus a bad name. It has taken over parts of the west of Britain and Ireland. At Kilmacurragh, we have grown rhododendrons for 200 years now. We're the oldest rhododendron garden on the island. And the vast majority of those rhododendrons still with us today are perfectly well behaved. A few will throw out a couple of self-sown seedlings now and again. But Rhododendron madnai is one of these threatened species that we conserve in the gardens at Kilmacurragh. Related to it is Rhododendron lindleyi, much less common in the wild, beautifully scented, tricky plant to grow in cultivation, but if you go to Mount Stewart in County Down, they're grown to perfection. So we move on to the next slide. It takes us up to the sort of plants that you see growing around the village. Lots of cobra lilies. Gerardinia palmata in the bottom center, you can see. This is what nettles look like in Sikkim. It's known as sisnu in the local Indian dialect. It makes a really good soup, But I can tell you that if you walk into it or brush against it, it's lightning plant identification because it really does lift you out of it. It's a very sharp sting. Just beside it, the lovely blue pea, Parachutus communis. I've seen it several times in the Himalaya. It's a lovely plant. Clover-like foliage and these lovely blue peas. So Glyn, we'll move on again. So what we're doing, we've left Chungthang, and for the moment we're going to travel up one of the feeders of the Tista River. So we're traveling up one of the eastern valleys, and this is the Lachen Valley, Lachen meaning small pass, and it's precipitous and cliff-like in its lower area. So we've moved from Chungthang. At Chungthang, you move from a tropical flora into a subtropical flora, into a warm temperate flora, into temperate very, very quickly. It is an amazing place that in such a small space that you can move so quickly between the vegetation types and even the altitude, the sequential altitudinal difference of the flora as well. So this is the Lachen River, and in the upper slide you can see Acer campbellii, a massive tree, 180 feet tall. You'll never see it that size in cultivation, and that's why it's worthwhile traveling into these Himalayan valleys. You don't get strong winds very rarely, and these trees are probably several hundred years old and they haven't been logged out of it, thankfully. Okay, Glenn. Moving up higher again, you meet some great plants with Wardia unigemata, the jewel fern. Its fronds are fully 3 meters long, and just beneath it you can see Tetracentrum sinense. This is what some authorities will call the Bar Himalaica. This is part of Sikkim's relic flora. A tetracentrum has been found in a fossil state in German coal deposits, so it did grow in Europe at one stage. So this particular Himalayan variant, you can see it's much more beautiful than the Chinese tree. It's got this very, very, very long drip tip. Scheffler rhododendrifolia, I'll come to that again in a while. It grows as big as a sycamore tree in Sikkim. And of course, all of the old world Schefflers have moved back into Heptaplurum. They're back in another genus. And lots of Paris species, Paris polyphylla in bloom on the floor. Okay, let's move again. Okay, so Hooker named a second white rhododendron species, again for an Irishman. So this is Pakenham Edgeworth. His full name was Michael Pakenham Edgeworth, but he's known to his friends as Pakenham Edgeworth. He grew up in Edwardstown in County Longford. His eldest sister was Maria Edgeworth, the famous novelist. He was one of 22 children, the youngest of 22 children. And Joseph Hooker named Rhododendron Edgeworthii for him. And it grows in Sikkim as an epiphyte on the trees. At this point, we were moving into Himalayan hemlock forest, Sugadomosa. They were close to 180 feet tall. And when you looked up into the trees, all you could see were hundreds and thousands of plants of Rhododendron Edgeworthii in bloom. If you look in the bottom right side, you can see a flash of white, and it's growing there epiphytically on Schefflera rhododendrofolia. Center bottom is the house that he lived in as a boy growing up in County Longford. Okay, so we'll move on again. So as you get higher up the valley, the flora changes. That's Daphne Leving Shackleton with Allantodia gigantea. So that's a pretty common fern in this part of India. Absolutely revels in the monsoon. You know, it probably wouldn't be as lush as that with us in Europe. It would miss out on all of that sort of precipitation. Sikkim is one of the wettest places in the Himalaya. We were lucky that we got very good conditions when we were there. We also saw Rhododendron triflorum. So this is one of Hooker's rhododendrons that was raised at Glasnevin in the spring of 1850 from his collections and made its way down here in 1862 from Joseph Hooker's collections. And lovely also to see Salix daltoniana, because of course he was Joseph Dalton Hooker. So these are sort of caterpillar-like catkins coming off the tree in early spring. So it's a rare treat to see that. You know, it's not something that's widely spread in the Himalaya, and we were very lucky to see it. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. Griffith's birth word. So poor William Griffith died, of course, by the age of 35, but he's immortalized in so many plants. He may have had a very short life, but everywhere you travel in this part of the world, you'll find plants named after William Griffith. So the birthworts, again, a bit like the tetracentron, it's part of Sikkim's relic flora. These are plants that are that have evolved very early. They're relic species. They've been around a very long time. And this is a spectacular species. That flower is as big as your outstretched hands. It's a lovely, lovely plant. And it's in cultivation, by the way. It is grown, I'm not quite sure here in Ireland, but I've certainly seen it in English gardens. So we'll move on again. Okay, so we've reached Lachen. So Lachen was made famous by Hooker. It's the type locality for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants. So if you grow Daphne phyllum himalayense, the type specimen came from here. You can see on the top is my modern day photograph, but on the bottom is Hooker's sketch of the village from 1848, 1849. And you can see it's hardly changed. It really hasn't grown that much at all. The same peaks in the background. We were there obviously in springtime, so the cashmere poplar, Populus ciliata, is just coming into leaf. And on the bottom is the high altitude variant of Daphne Balua Vardesiele. And this is the plant, of course, that Buddhist scripts are made from, because you can make paper from Daphne Balua. Lovely Primula gracilipes just coming into bloom. And on the bottom, Fragaria nubicola. Nubicola, of course, meaning of the clouds, because it's a monsoon species. So that's a little wild strawberry. I remember growing up in West Wicklow and picking strawberries on the back road to national school. So just lovely to see native Irish strawberries and then see these lovely Himalayan strawberries looking very similar in the Himalaya. So, okay, we'll move on again. Anybody who knows Kilmacurragh, you'll know the famous tree of Magnolia Campbellii, named for Archibald Campbell. There's a fascinating story behind our old tree. It was dug up as a seedling near the hill station of Darjeeling. It was sent down to Calcutta. It was from there put in a Wardian case and put on the deck of a ship and sailed back to Europe. It was planted against a wall garden at the walls of the wall garden in 1876. It didn't blossom till 31 years later, 1907. And nowadays, it's one of the largest known captive specimens in cultivation and carries thousands of blossoms every year. Ours is the pink flowered form, but what was very exciting was to travel up the Lachen Valley and see Magnolia Camellia alba group, the white flowered form. And that is the form that was first discovered by William Griffith. And Hooker, in his original description, in his Latin diagnosis, he said that they basically Floris roseus, rarus albus, so that that flowers were rose-coloured and rarely white. But actually, in some places, you do get all of these white-flowered forms. Lovely also to see rhododendron campylocarbon, yellow flowers, and I'll come back to that later. And cobra lilies, you can see Arisaema nepenthoides there, growing in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands along these sort of subalpine slopes. But what was a real treat is to see plants that absolutely refuse all efforts in cultivation. So on the bottom left is Bryocarpum himalaicum. So this is a primula relative with soldanella-like flowers. It's been introduced time and time again to cultivation, and it's absolutely refused to persist in cultivation. So it means that really the best way to see this plant in bloom is to travel out to the Sikkim Himalaya and see it in bloom in April and May. So we'll move on again. Great, thank you, Glenn. Rhododendron. So we've moved into mega rhododendron country, and as we heard from Matthew in his talk earlier this week, Joseph Hooker doubled the number of species in cultivation after his travels in Sikkim. At the time, the largest collection of rhododendrons in Europe grew in the garden of Florence Nightingale. In Hampshire, and Hooker doubled that number. So you can see in the centre, Rhododendron cinnabrylum, one of the most poisonous species of rhododendrons. It contains huge amounts of a chemical called andromedotoxin, which, if it's eaten by goats, they will foam from the teeth and are dead within minutes. Even the smoke from burning branches is poisonous. And I'm sure you've all heard of mad honey from the Himalaya. That if these produce honey from that's based on the nectar of this plant, and if you eat it, actually, you can become very, very ill. You can become delirious, or if you have enough of it, it will actually kill you. So, and of course, Rhododendron arboreum, Varicinomomium, beautiful different colour forms. This lovely red flowered form that is quite common in these valleys. On the top left is Dolichosia longissima. This is a species of lichen that once grew in Europe, but during the industrial era, our atmosphere was so polluted that it's killed. It's no longer part of the lichen flora of Europe. Okay, Glenn. And Rhododendron campanulatum, pleased to be able to show this species tonight because it's one of the parents of Rhododendron Thomas Acton. And he crossed it with Rhododendron, or David Moore crossed it with Rhododendron arboreum, subspecies Cinnamonium, to create Thomas Acton. So you can see how variable it is from the top right slide. It ranges from these lovely violet colours in whites into these sort of lavender blues. Lovely plant, little bit like Rhododendron willickii, which just turn the leaf and you'll see this very dense brown ingumentum on the other side of the leaf. And you can see it here growing on the banks of the Lachen River in Sikkim. Okay, so we'll move on again. Okay, so we're reaching high altitude at this point. And we're moving up towards the Tibetan border. Relative humidity is dropping rapidly as we make our way up there. So we're beginning to meet with some of the alpine species. So again, actually, we've spoken through the week about the conservation of rhododendron species, and a lot of these species are threatened. The frightening thing is that with global warming, is that glaciers are and some of the largest glaciers in the eastern Himalaya are in Sikkim. I've trekked up to some of these at Gochila on the eastern flank of Kanchenjunga. and the glaciers are retreating and retreating at a really rapid rate. Also, as well, the climate is warming, and that is putting enormous pressure on these alpine species that like to be covered with snow in winter time. So sadly, actually, there is a huge proportion of rhododendron species that are threatened in the wild. So Glenn, we'll just move on again. So in the top left, this is what's known as Hooker's Rock. And you can see in the inset, that's Hooker's sketch. It's huge. That rock is the size of a modern house. It's an erratic. It was dumped there by retreating glaciers in past times. And surrounded by some of Hooker's discoveries, so plants like Taraxacum tibetanum. So that is a dandelion species that's endemic to the Tibetan Plateau, because essentially we are on the Tibetan Plateau at this point. It may be politically part of India, but really geographically, this is part of the Tibetan Plateau. Primula denticulata, which I'll come to again in a moment, but above it is this lovely Primula calderiana. It's a lovely plant, but unfortunately, it smells of fish, which isn't terribly pleasant, I can tell you. And that lovely sort of silver farina. So we'll move on again. Okay, so what we've done is we come back down the Lachen Valley to Chungthang, and now we're going to trace our way up the more eastern valley, the Lachung Valley, and this is the unmissable valley in Sikkim. Now you'll notice actually that when we're up at Tongloo, at Hooker's Rock, that things are only beginning to wake up. We were there on the 1st of May and we were just planting potatoes that day. And this is a day later, and you can see in this lower part of the valley, potatoes are already in bloom. Just behind the waterfall is a whole spray of Virginia ciliata. So again, it gives you a very good idea of what these plants like in cultivation. So wet, damp, and as much humidity as you can give them. So this is a traditional Bhutia village. So at this point, you meet two different ethnic groups. So in the Lachen Valley, you meet the Lachenpa people, who are now amongst the Lachungpa people, and they are an ethnic mix of the early Tibetan settlers with the indigenous people, the Lepcha people, who Hooker actually hired as his collectors. So we'll move on again. So these are some of the plants that we meet, so you can see, and some edible. So Elaeagnus parvifolia, it is, they say, a food for the future. I think it's an acquired taste. I have to say I tried them and I didn't like them. And you can see here our porters are gathering the fruits of Rubus ellipticus. It's a species of bramble or blackberry, but of course one of the things that you need to be careful of is what you introduce. Now, I should state at this point that we weren't collecting, that we were there for photographic reasons. I was working towards the book. But in past times, the species of bramble has been introduced, and it's a noxious weed in different parts of the world, particularly in Hawaii, where it's just ran riot. So these are the sort of things that you need to be careful of introducing. Heteronepalensis, of course, is the Himalayan ivy. You can see it in fruit above. So we'll move on again. So what is great is that Hooker didn't quite get everything. It is remarkable that everywhere where you walk there's Hooker plants, but he did miss this species. This is Deutzia bhutanensis, which was described from Bhutan, which lies just next door, in 1973, and was recently found as a native in this particular valley. It's one of the rarest plants in the Lachung Valley. Lovely plant. So we'll move on again. So Lachung has changed very, very little. And you can see both of Hooker's sketches on the bottom corners. And you can actually trace the very same mountains. The village itself hasn't grown enormously. There's always been a bid, even under sort of British control, this part of with immigrants and migrants from Nepal and from other parts of India. So it really is strong stronghold of the endemic people up there. They're Buddhists, as you can see from the Buddhist prayer flags. Okay, so Glenn, we'll move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a view, it's late evening, just above the village of the Lachung River. And this, of course, has come off the glaciers of the Tibetan border. And those waters ultimately meet the Ganges and flow out into the Bay of Bengal. You can see all sorts of really great plants, ginseng on the top, panic pseudo ginseng, trilliums. So you don't really always associate trilliums, you always think of them more about North America. But of course, this is an Asian species. And Cardiocrinum giganteum, the giant Himalayan lily. Great to see it, but I still remember seeing the group beating back pretty quickly when leeches in their hundreds began to drop onto us from the trees above these. And Pisces spinulosa, just carrying embryonic cones, and this, of course, is the East Himalayan spruce. Great, so we'll move on again. So Richard Baines, in his lecture on propagation, showed a slide of Rhododendron Camellia florum yesterday. So here it is in the flesh alongside Hooker's plate from rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya. And lovely to see Rhododendron arboreum in bloom. It is one of my desert island rhododendrons. It's aptly named, it forms a huge tree. In November 2019, I led a group up Mount Japfu in Nagaland on the Burma border, northeast India. And we saw a tree there. It's in the Guinness Book of Records as the tallest rhododendron in the world. It's fully 108 feet tall, huge tower of colour at this time of year. And of course, just above it, Acer sycamense, and this lovely form of Piptanthus nepalensis, the Himalayan laburnum, growing on the banks of the river. So we'll move on again. Okay, so earlier I showed you an image of Dendrobium nobile, which I stated was the national flower of Sikkim. So this is the national tree of Sikkim. It's Rhododendron niveum, niveum meaning snow-like. So when it pushes out its new growths, it's absolutely beautiful. It's covered in this sort of absolutely snow-like ingementum. It's incredibly rare. It's the rarest species that you'll find in Sikkim. If you look at Hooker's description in the Flora of British India, he lists it for some of the interior valleys that are no longer found there today. And the reason why is because of landslides. The Himalaya is uplifting all the time. It's a very wet monsoon country. So you'll get entire mountainsides literally sliding down an earthquake after an earthquake. So several populations have been lost due to that. But it's an incredible color. You can see it's an incredible color. It was the color of both the church and of royalty. And in about 1870, it was a very difficult color to manufacture. So from the 1870s, somebody discovered how to make it very cheaply. It became absolutely abundant, that particular shade, and everybody's curtains, everybody's couches, rugs were made from it, and it became deeply unfashionable. And sadly, actually, the result was that in the 1920s and the 1930s, Rhododendron niveum was grubbed up wholesale out of collections. So you can see it here on the left in its wild native haunt, growing with Abies densa, with the Himalaya rising above it. And to me, that is the best way to see a plant in its native habitat. I have to say, I come back, it's in bloom here at Kilmacurragh at present. And I get back to Kilmacurragh having seen it, like these little plants in the wild, and it almost feels like a zoo. But actually, they're still important plants. They do highlight to the public the peril of these plants in the wild with global warming, with population rise, and it's part of the really important conservation work that we carry out here. So we'll move on from Rhododendron niveum, the national tree of Sikkim, to the next slide. Onto other rhododendrons. And it is incredibly biodiverse at this point, and particularly in rhododendron species. So all these species are grown within meters of each other at a place called Yakche. And you can see plants like Rhododendron ciliatum. And Rhododendron ciliatum is a sort of a low-growing bush, lovely white flowers, and it was crossed with other species like Rhododendron edgeworthii and Rhododendron formosanum to create the sort of the wonderful scented rhododendrons that we have in our gardens today. So if you know plants like Rhododendron Lady Alice Fitzwilliam, Fragrantissimum, Empress of India, they contain a lot of blood of Sikkim rhododendrons. Rhododendron pendulum is one of the sort of the rarest species. You do very rarely see it in gardens. It's growing here as an epiphyte in Yakche, and then in the center Rhododendron glaucophyllum. So these are all low-growing bushes. So not all of Sikkim's rhododendron flora are these giant trees. Some of them are actually are quite low-growing. So we'll move on again. So these are some of the trees we saw, and we're getting closer and closer and closer to the Tibetan frontier at this point. So one of my favorite plants in the Himalaya is Viburnum nervosum. Most of my trips are normally in the autumn. It could be any time sort of between September, October, but most often in November. And at that time, it's post-monsoon. You can see the mountains. And Viburnum nervosum has spectacular autumn colour, but it was lovely to see it in bloom, but not just that, just to see how a viburnum species could form trees, which I'd never seen in other parts of the Himalaya. These were huge. And then just beside it, Prunus cornuta. So this is the Himalayan version of our native bird cherry that we grow in Ireland and is native to Ireland, Prunus cornuta, with lovely new bronze growths, and it was absolutely abundant in this part of the Himalaya. So we'll move on again. I know I've gone over time, so I won't. I'll try and move on swiftly. So we've reached the Shingba Rhododendron Sanctuary, and this is again at extremely high altitude. And you can see my group up in the top, in the top right. So several members of the garden staff and the guide staff at Kilmacurragh have travelled with me. And on the bottom, you can see cobra lily. So this is Griffith's cobra lily, or same as Griffithii. And you can see why they're called cobra lilies. I mean, it is a little bit startling looking through your camera lens and something like a snake is looking back at you. So that's Griffith's cobra lily. Okay, so we'll move on again, please, Glenn. On to what has to be one of the premier Sikkim species. So this is Rhododendron thomsoni. So you can see Thomas Thompson in the top centre. He went to school with Joseph Hooker in Scotland. They went to university together. They plant hunted together, and not just that. When they were both back in Europe, they worked together on the flora of British India. So he was a surgeon in the East India Company, and Hooker liked him so much that he named one of the best species of rhododendrons from the Himalaya after him. So it was a great time to be alive and to be plant hunting and to sort of know Joseph Hooker and have plants named after him. And again, actually seeing these plants in the wild, it gives you a good indication of what they like, because look very closely at those slides. You can see that it's not growing underneath trees, it's out in the open. So instantly, you know, don't plant it in the shelter of woodland, get it out into the open. If you look back in the background of the bottom left slide, you can see it's a scree behind there. So it's growing on gravel. So it needs absolutely sharp drainage. The fastest way to kill Rhododendron thomsoni is to put it into heavy clay. It needs an open site, it needs shelter, but it needs very sharp drainage. Beautiful plant, red flowers. All the best clones have red calyces. So it's in bloom with us at the moment, and we're really lucky that we do actually have a lovely clone with red calyces behind the corolla. And it's been used time and time again in hybridization, and it was one of the species that was seized upon by the early hybridizers in Britain and Ireland and North America. So we'll move on again. So Sir Henry Elwes introduced a lot of Joseph Hooker's discoveries in the 1870s, and one of those was Arisaema utile. You can see featured in Botanic from his collections. He brought tubers back to England, and named utile or useful because the hill folk, it's a very poor hill folk. Food would run out, famine became a problem, and they learned how to dig these up and ferment the tubers and how to eat them. And really, it was just a start they were getting there. It was a terrible diet because if you didn't ferment them enough, your hair fell out, your skin turned green, and they must have been pretty hungry to eat this plant. I have to say, much more spectacular as an ornamental plant than as an edible, useful plant. Utile is probably not the best specific epithet. Okay, so we'll move on again. So we discussed seeing, and Hooker even discussed in the Journal of the Horticultural Society, later the Royal Horticultural Society, meeting hybrids in the wild. So these are some of the hybrids that we met along the way. So this is the first you can see at the top left is Rhododendron X candelabrum, which Hooker met. He didn't realize it was a hybrid at the time. But that is a hybrid of Thompsonite with the yellow flowered top of the carpel, so red with yellow, making these lovely peach colours. And the bottom is Rhododendron X Sikkimense, so that's a natural hybrid between Rhododendron barbatum and Rhododendron arboreum. And then up top, these are just some blossoms I'd picked and put in a rock for comparison purposes. So this is, if you look on the left, you can see Rhododendron Thompsoni, on the right, Rhododendron campanulatum, and in the middle, the intermediate plant between it. So there was some confusion when Hooker's rhododendrons were introduced. And many years later, at Cartley in Cornwall, Lord Aberconway spotted one of Hooker's seedlings, named it after the owner of the garden, Sir Charles Lemon, and it's a natural hybrid between campanulatum and arboreum. So we'll move on again. Up to the Yumthang Valley, the highest reaches, and absolutely spectacular to walk through this yak pasture, looking up towards the Tibetan border, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres turned purple by a little Primula denticulata, very common in cultivation, introduced to cultivation by the East India Company, and just a spectacular landscape. So we'll move on again into the woodlands. So Rhododendron hodgeni, of course, is a woodland plant, and you can see it here, named for Brian Hodgins, whose house you saw earlier. Lovely plant. We grow it here again, likes good drainage, and we'll move on again. What is incredibly rare in gardens is Rhododendron whitei. It was lost to cultivation for a long time. You can see this is the true plant on the left-hand side of the slide, but on the top left is the monster that was accepted as whitei for a long, long time. This is a plant at Mount Isham that originally came from Kilmacurragh, but the real plant is a superb plant. The Actons at Kilmacurragh had cousins in County Donegal at a place called Ardnamona. They sent rhododendrons up there. In 1953, when Queen Elizabeth was crowned, part of her coronation bouquet came from a mix of British and Irish gardens, and Rhododendron whitei, the original Kilmacurragh plant growing at Ardnamona, was used as part of that coronation bouquet. So we do have links to 1953. So when we were trekking through this piece of woodland, I was trekking with Salish Pradhan and one of his people, Tupton Sering, our Tibetan guide, and we went there to see a very rare hybrid, Rhododendron X decipiens, which is a Rhododendron falconeri hybrid. And we move on to the next slide, please. We went in, and Rhododendron decipiens is a Rhododendron hodgeni falconeri hybrid, but what puzzled me was that there was no sign of falconeri. We were at a far too high an altitude for it to exist. So the penny dropped. We were looking at a new undescribed natural hybrid. And to cut a long story short, I named it for Tupton, who you can see in the centre slide. Tupton escaped Tibet during the Cultural Revolution. He and his family travelled with their yaks down into Sikkim. They settled in Sikkim. Tupton himself was later adopted by Tenzing Norgay, and he's an incredible man, self-taught botanist, a devout Buddhist, and so I named the rhododendron for him. It needed to be segregated from the true decipiens. So it's an extremely rare plant in the Sikkim flora, and it's one of these natural hybrids that needed a distinctive name. So we'll move on again. And these are the sort of landslides that have destroyed entire populations of Rhododendron niveum. So this mountainside collapsed after an earthquake, and it came down with such force that it blasted the forest away on the other side of the valley. Forests were flattened and a new lake formed, and already Primula denticulata was beginning to colonize those shattered remains. It was slightly disconcerting walking through it because those boulders are as big as skyscrapers. It's an entire mountain that's come down, and they were still moving a year later, so you do need to be careful walking through there. So we'll move on again. Great. So we've moved back down out of both of those valleys. We're back at Chungthang at the confluence of the Lachen and Lachung rivers, and this is looking at subtropical plants. And what Hooker found amazing was that you can see bananas there growing on the banks of the Tista River, but actually the glaciers, the biggest glaciers in the eastern Himalaya, lie just a couple of miles upstream. So you can see plants like cardamom growing in the wild, these lovely Sikkim spiderworts, Aeschylanthus parviflorus, hanging epiphytically from the trees, and these gorgeous balsams. So this is Impatiens arcuta, which Hooker discovered in this very spot. Mangan is landslide country, and because of landslides, the road was blocked, and we got time to botanize in this area as a result. So we'll move on again. I realize I'm well over time, so I'm going to move fast to the last of the slides. Gangtok, we stopped to visit Dave Pradhan. So this is Keshav Pradhan with his wife Shanti and his son Sailesh. And Sailesh is a great friend. I actually had a video call with him today. He's sitting in Gangtok, me sitting in my living room here in Kilmacurragh. So Keshav Pradhan is the most famous plantsman in India. He was awarded the Veitch Memorial Medal by the Royal Horticultural Society in 2011. He was a royal protege. The King of Sikkim picked out the brightest students from Sikkim. He was sent by the royal family to study forestry at Yale, but his father before him had been head forester to the King of Sikkim. And Keshav is an expert on rhododendrons, an expert on primulas, and not just that, he was involved in the formation of Kanchenjunga National Park. So we move on again. One of the other places we visited in Gangtok was the Rajvahan. So this was the seat of the British political officer in Sikkim, Claude White. You can see beneath one of the plants he discovered in Bhutan, Primula whitei, here photographed at Beach Park, David Shackleton's garden. And David, of course, was the father-in-law of Daphne Leving Shackleton, who's traveling with us. It's a very historic place. We met the governor of Sikkim there, but the reason I went there was really to see this building, its lovely garden. And you can see from the top right slide, Ludlow and Sheriff, the famous English plant collectors, they used it as a staging post. So did Frank Kingdon Ward and Lord Potter in 1924 when they went on their trip to Southeast Tibet, and so did Francis Younghusband in 1903. So we'll move on again to Kolkata, formerly Calcutta. It's one of my favorite places in Sikkim. It's just a wonderful city. This is a view of the headquarters on the top left of the British East India Company's headquarters in Kolkata. And of course, the Royal Botanic Garden, Calcutta. Really, really, really historic garden. You can see this is the house in the bottom right was built by William Roxburgh. And this is where the founding fathers of Indian botany were based, and it includes people like William Roxburgh, Nathaniel Wallich, William Griffith, Thomas Thompson, Hugh Faulkner. They were all superintendents of that garden, and Hooker was based there. So we'll move on again. So I'm coming to the very end, finally, and I just want to show you of the 4 expeditions I led to this part of the Himalaya, the highlights. So this is 2012, and I know many of my colleagues that travelled with me are watching in tonight, so welcome everybody. I hope this brings back really warm memories for you all. In the top left is the very first view I had of the Kanchenjunga Massif. So this is looking out from my hotel window at 5:30 in the morning in November 2012. And my line of view is at an altitude of 7,000 feet. But just to let you know that in a valley just beneath that ridge in the foreground, that valley drops fully 5,000 feet down to an altitude of 2,000 feet. So the altitudinal difference between the bottom of that valley and the top of that mountain is fully 22,000 feet. And what fascinated Hooker was that you had every single vegetation type within view of that. So a tropical flora, an absolutely tropical flora at the bottom of the valley, moving into a subtropical flora, into a warm temperate flora, into a temperate flora, into a coniferous zone, into alpines, into rock, scree and ice. So that's the Kanchenjunga Massif. And in the bottom left, that's myself and Kristen Jameson and Rob Wilson Wright, 2 really good Irish plants people. And what is incredible is that it's 160 years later, and we're using a facsimile of the rhododendrons of the Sikkim Himalaya to identify rhododendron species. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at the highlights of 2013. And on the bottom right is Campbell's cottage. So that is the house that Archibald Campbell of Magnolia Campbellii fame, that's his house. That's the house that he lived in. So it's such a historic place. In the center, you can see two enormous cashmere cypresses. They're the very trees that Joseph Hooker sketched and published in Himalayan journals. And then really wonderful to see it at the top right is the Taj Mahal at Agra. Really is the most beautiful building in the world. So we'll move on again to 2014. 2014 was the most difficult of all the expeditions I led. It was a mountaineering trip, so we trekked right up onto the Gotila. We reached 16,500 feet, so that's 5 kilometers higher than where I'm sitting here in Ireland. Air, it was absolutely thin. You know, you're breathing in half the oxygen that you're used to, but we made it right up onto the eastern flank of Kanchenjunga. And just a stunning view of the third greatest mountain on the planet. So you can see our campsite with Mount Pandam in the background. So we'll move on again to the final and ultimate trip. I really wanted to see plants in bloom, and this was just a lovely trip. And you've got the gist of it, of course, this evening. And we decided to treat ourselves. So on the bottom right is the most lovely hotel, gorgeous hotel. It's the Oberoi Grand Hotel in the center of Calcutta. That was our accommodation, and it was a great place to stay. So I'm going to finish the lecture with the next slide. And this is a view of the Yumtang Valley, and this is the Himalaya is about. So I realize I've gone over time, but ladies and gentlemen, I hope this gives you a flavour of the Sikkim Himalaya, what plants are about. And I just want to say it was gardens here that inspired me to travel out there, and Joseph Hooker's travels. It is amazing that a Victorian botanist who's dead over 110 years still inspires today. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
I'll have to do the round of applause, Séamus, for everybody.
Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fantastic. And I can see from the comments, people really, really enjoyed it, Séamus.
Great.
I just wondered, my God, how accessible are those valleys? I mean, was the public transport? Did you do a lot of walking or hiking?
On that particular trip, actually relatively accessible. Particularly, that's the great thing about North Sikkim is that it's got a very good road network, and all those road networks were put in by Claude White. But the 2014 trip, the mountaineering trip, we left everything behind us. Once you get above Yumtang, you're on mule tracks, and that's why we'd bring on that particular trip. We brought about 30 porters and pack animals with us to bring everything we needed up the mountain. So when you trek towards Kanchenjunga, for instance, you're in a national park. There's no roads, and it's very sustainable. You know, you're not bringing in vehicles. We brought in, our own gas cylinders, so we weren't cutting down trees like bonfires. We didn't build bonfires. That's one of the other pearls, of course, of travel in the Himalaya, is that it's ecotourism has done huge damage because you're cutting down trees to build bonfires at night time. So we had the principle that we were not going to build bonfires, and we brought all of the the gas cylinders that we needed for cooking, for heating, and so on at night time. But certainly that trip that you've just seen is very accessible.
And can people book? I'm just saying, not you particularly, but say somebody was watching you and was inspired and wanted to go on a travel. Can they book with tour agents to go there?
Absolutely. So I would recommend, and because he was so good and looked after us so well, Sailesh Pradhan. And if you Google Sikkim Adventure, he does very sustainable ecotourism. He's a plantsman. He knows all of these plants. He's got very good staff as well. You know, he's got 2 exceptionally good Tupton, who you've seen, who I named the rhododendron for, and another guy called Neelan. It's not difficult. It is a little bit expensive, but it's worth every penny. And just to take
Sounds good.
Darjeeling,
Yeah.
yes, so definitely worth going to visit.
Okay, well, we have a look at some of the questions here. One of them is Rhododendron whitei named after the Isle of Wight?
Rhododendron whitei.
Yeah, Whighti.
So White was an early British botanist who was based in Sri Lanka. So not named for the Isle of Wight. White was based in the Purnina Botanic Gardens in Sri Lanka. He was a friend of Joseph Hooker's. So like I said, if you befriended Joseph Hooker, he named all these lovely plants after you. So Rhododendron whitei, it's a tricky species, and that's why it's so rarely seen in gardens.
Okay, brilliant, thanks. And another question we have from Eileen is, at what point in your career did you begin plant hunting expeditions?
Ooh, okay. Well, it's funny, I was just thinking about this today. The very first time I was thinking today when I saw a rhododendron was, I grew up in boating class in West Wicklow, and the very first rhododendron I saw was Arboreum when I was about 7. My first real plant hunting expedition was when I lived in Spain as a student in, gosh, I'm going to give off my age now, Felicity, but it was 1991. So as a student at class 11, I went out on a 6-month-long scholarship to a horticultural college in Spain. And my first ever real plant hunting expedition was a break from living just outside of Valencia, and I went up to the Picos de Europa in northern Spain and went looking at alpines in the Picos. So that was probably my first real stab at plant hunting. But first real stab at professional plant exploration was 1996 to Yunnan province, a 5-week expedition to northwest Yunnan.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, I see Miles Reid is there. Hi, Miles. And he wants the Hooker book still available.
Absolutely. Oh, Miles, thank you for that plug. Really grateful. Miles, I should say, was part of the new team when I started at Kilmacurragh, and he is one of the absolute best members of staff that we've employed at Kilmacurragh. Miles, we really miss you. We miss your tours. And of course, Miles was one of the early researchers into the history of Kilmacurragh. So yes, the book is available widely through Amazon. It is published by Q Publishing, and one of the few benefits, it's an ill wind that blows no good, of lockdown is that it sold like hotcakes over the pandemic period. So yes, it is available.
Well, anybody who has it should have it. I was looking through it this afternoon, and it's ages since I took it down from the shelf, but it's a fantastic book, and it's so interesting. And again, to Seamus, then you look at all of these areas and plants again, it's fantastic. Really great. Okay, so that's absolutely brilliant. Has anybody else got any other questions, or do you have anything you want to say, Seamus?
I do actually, Felicity. So we're celebrating rhododendrons, and it's Rhododendron Week, and it's a great way to celebrate 25 years of ownership of the gardens and management of the gardens by the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland. Kilmacurragh is really lucky to be under the brow of Glasnevin. And over the 25 years that we've had gardens here at Kilmacurragh, there's been sterling work carried out. So I just want to pay tribute this evening to people like Paul Norton, who moved in 1996 and spent 10 years beginning the clearing of the gardens at Kilmacurragh, and then to my own team, who for a further 15 years have been busy taking out a huge undergrowth, a jungle of sycamores, of cherry laurel, and it's been hard work. Really has been hard work. So I want to pay tribute to the garden team at Kilmacurragh for doing all of that work. But as has been said, this is a new annual event at Kilmacurragh. And one of the things that we really like to do is to sort of let people know and educate people better about rhododendrons, and particularly in Britain and Ireland, where we have a major problem on our hands with parts of the western seaboards and places like Wales, Scotland, England, and the west of Ireland being taken over by an alien invasive, which is called Rhododendron ponticum, but in fact is a hybrid. So Rhododendron ponticum is native to Turkey and surrounding areas. It actually was part of our native flora in Ireland in pre-glacial times and was perfectly behaved then. It was introduced about 250 years ago. And in the 19th century, two American related species were introduced, Rhododendron catabiense and Rhododendron maximum. And unfortunately, they met, they married, and they created a monster. So the rhododendron that you see in the Big Willie Cuddy Reeks, on the Bee in Waterford, in the west coast of Scotland and places like Argyll, that's a man-made hybrid. So there are 1,200 species of rhododendrons out there, and there's one man-made monster. They should have never met. They never would have met only for a human intervention. And I just want to get the point across that we're not celebrating the rhododendron that has become an invasive in Britain and Ireland. We're celebrating the 1,200 true species that are absolutely perfectly behaved plants and that are in jeopardy. So this is the red list of rhododendrons. It's produced and published by the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and it's a huge publication, and it makes for sad reading. Lots of rhododendrons are threatened in the wild for various different reasons. Climate change, the disappearance of glaciers, the climate is warming really, really fast. And the fact that there's just too many people on the planet. If you go to Nepal, it's really sad. You'll see entire mountainsides of rhododendron arboretum being stripped out of it. In parts of Bhutan, for campfires, for visiting people, they've now stopped people putting down rhododendrons to make way for campfires. So that's the main point that I want to get across really tonight, Felicity. That that rhododendron that has become a pest is a man-made hybrid. If I can as well, actually, I just want to say a word of thanks, because it's wonderful that we can, in pandemic times, that we can show you rhododendrons, because of course here in Ireland we're restricted county-wise, and I know that it was heartbreaking for people not to be able to get to Kilmacurragh last year. We were closed, but throughout this week, now that we're back open at a county level, people are coming up to us and saying thank you so much for reopening, and they're just thrilled to be back in the garden, and it looks wonderful. So I do want to say thanks tonight to the Royal Horticultural Society's Rhododendron Camellia Magnolia Group. It's been a pleasure collaborating with the group. There's two people in particular that I really would like to say thank you to. And yes, I do realise there's an echo coming through. I do apologise for that, and I don't think there's much I can do about that. I'd like to say thank you to Wendelin Morrison and to Mark Bobbin. So Mark is the communications officer with the group, and Wendelin is the events coordinator, and they produced a wonderful video. Right, echo is gone. So Wendelin and Mark produced a wonderful video that we put on our YouTube channel this week. So the Rhododendron Camellia Magnolia Group is an international group belonging to the Royal Horticultural Society. I'm the Irish branch chair. So take a look at our website. It is worth, if you're passionate about those three genera, it is worth looking at. And it's repeating history, because its earliest foundations was the Rhododendron Society, 25 original members, and one of those founding members was Sir Frederick Moore, who advised here in the gardens and was a director, keeper, curator at Glasnevin. I'd also like to say very quickly an enormous thank you to all of our OPW colleagues right across the organisation, also within our own department, the National Historic Properties, which looks after the portfolio of important state-owned properties in Ireland, Glasnevin and Kilmacurragh included. They gave us enormous help in putting this together. I want to say a huge thank you to the speakers who came on at very short notice. Matthew Deb, our director. Matthew, I know that you put a lot of work into getting that talk together very, very quickly. I'm really grateful to you that. It was a great lead-in to my talk. You covered the history, I covered the modern day sort of travel in Hooker's footsteps. So Matthew, thank you for that. Richard Baines. Richard's a really good friend. He is almost like my parallel in Scotland. He manages a satellite belonging to a national botanic gardens, in his case, the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. Great talk last night, and I really did like the practical side of it, and not just that Richard covered conservation aspects of rhododendrons. Yeah, and if I just go back to Matthew as well, I just want to say thank you for launching the first annual Rhododendron Week for us as well, and coming down and helping in organising the videos. I want to say again a huge thank you to my own garden staff, to the garden team here at Kilmacurragh. The gardens have never looked better, absolutely beautiful at the moment. Kilmacurragh had a really sad history in the 20th century, and what is wonderful is that it's coming back. It was the best private collection on this island up to the Great War. 14 grew over in the 20th century, but I'm pretty confident in saying that Kilmacurragh is entering its second golden era. You'll see very exciting changes over the next 2 years in terms of expansion and preservation of a very historic structure. And I'd also, Felicity, like to say to you and your staff a huge thank you, because all of you have worked really, really well. Charlotte, Lynn, Kira, am I missing anybody? But I know that there were lots of you involved, and to Mary O'Neill Maloney and her guide team here at Kilmacurragh for their work, and actually to you guys who are looking in. We have a global audience tonight, so I can see there's people from Canada, from Chile, from Germany, from Finland, the USA, the UK, and West Wicklow this evening as well. So I'm going to finish on that this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. We're not finished with Rhododendron Week just yet. We are uploading videos again tomorrow. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues at the National Botanic Gardens of Ireland, to all of you watching across the world, thank you very much for your attention. You're muted there, Felicity.
Yeah, I am. Sorry. I've been muted.
Okay. Great. I see some nice comments coming in from Jane saying that she's enjoyed. We've had plenty of comments actually coming in, say how much you're enjoying the garden. So well, that's great. And Mark and Wendelin, I know you're watching in tonight, so thank you again for your sterling work from the Royal Horticultural Society's Rhododendron Magnolia Group.
Good night.
Okay.